Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today into some material that uses, well, a pretty bizarre example. We're talking about radioactive shrimps.
Yeah, it certainly grabs your attention.
It does, and the sources use this specific contamination incident as a sort of critical window into the whole global trade system. So our mission today isn't just about the scandal itself. It's really to analyze the core argument behind it.
Which is
that these shocking food safety failures, they're not random accidents. The argument is they're actually reliable symptoms.
Symptoms of a deeper problem.
Exactly. Symptoms of, well, what the source calls a systemic sickness. Basically, the idea that capitalism, or at least this version of it, prioritizes profit over, well, human life.
It's a very pointed critique. And what really jumps out, I think, is how quickly the analysis moves beyond the seafood.
Right.
It focuses almost immediately on the pattern, the sort of procedural thing that happens every time there's a contamination event. I mean, think about it. Some shocking discovery hits the news, could be a recall, a hidden chemical, or, in this case, it's something truly alarming like radioactivity. So what happens next?
Well, that's the thing. There's the initial panic, right? The public is understandably upset, demanding answers. Then you see the authorities step in. Companies issue these very carefully worded statements.
Assuring everyone it was an isolated error.
Precisely. Or talking about enhanced compliance protocols. And then almost inevitably, the whole story it kind of fades.
Yeah, it slips off the front page. A month later, who remembers? We've all moved on.
And that, according to these sources we looked at, that's the really insidious part. The actual machinery of global production, of trade, it just keeps grinding along. It's basically unaffected by this momentary noise.
The system protects itself. It makes sure the underlying economic logic, the drive for profit, stays completely untouched. And this repetition, this pattern, is really key to the whole critique.
Because if the pattern of scandal response forget is predictable,
then the cause must be structural, right? Not just some random one-off accident.
Which brings us right to the core mechanism the sources say drives this whole cycle. One source calls it, pretty bluntly, the invisible poison of profit. Sounds almost too simple, maybe. But the argument is that the systemic failure boils down to one basic equation that governs global business.
Okay, what's the equation?
Reduce costs relentlessly. Increase output exponentially, and therefore maximize margins. Is the source really saying every decision, regardless of the moral side of things, flows from that?
They absolutely are. And the crucial point they make is that this isn't just, a suggestion. It's presented as the central organizing principle. So if the whole system is optimized purely for financial return,
then everything else has to take a back seat.
By definition, yeah. Things like ethical oversight, environmental sustainability, even basic food safety checks, they become secondary or maybe even tertiary. I mean, if the company figures out it can shave, say, 10% off the cost of producing 10 million pounds of shrimp by cutting corners.
Like sourcing from farms that aren't properly monitored?
Yeah.
Or using cheaper, maybe faster processing?
Exactly. The structure of the current system, according to this critique, basically dictates that they will pursue that option. Because the incentive is overwhelmingly towards lower cost, higher margin.
But hang on, don't we have regulations? Safety nets, compliance agencies, all that stuff designed specifically to stop those kinds of corner cutting? How does the critique deal with the argument that maybe we just need, better enforcement, not a whole new system?
It dismisses that pretty much entirely. The source seems to view contamination and these failures not as accidents that happen despite the system, but as necessary inevitabilities because of the system.
Yeah.
The incentives, they argue, are fundamentally broken from the start.
How so?
Well, why would a company invest millions in, say, preventative safety measures that eat into their margins when the potential fine for a breach, well, it's often just calculated as a manageable business expense?
Sort of like a cost of doing business.
Exactly. In this framework, the risk of poisoning consumers is effectively just absorbed into the business model. It's factored in.
Wow. That reframing from accident to inevitability, that's pretty chilling.
It is.
It completely changes how you might look at something like a product recall. Makes it sound less like a mistake and more like an expected outcome.
It does. And that idea is kind of strengthened by things like limited liability laws, right?
What do you mean?
Well, the people making the big systemic decisions, they rarely face the personal physical consequences if something goes wrong. The company, the financial entity, pays the fine. But the consumer, they bear the health risk. That separation, according to this critique, basically institutionalizes negligence. It makes it easier.
Okay, so let's connect this to global trade. Because we do celebrate the sort of triumph of globalization, don't we? We see all the abundance on our shelves, this incredible variety. Shrimp from Indonesia, maybe rice from India, beef from Brazil, spices blended from a dozen countries.
Right, it looks like connection efficiency.
On the surface, yes. But the source material paints a much, much darker picture of this global plate.
The critique basically asks us to stop just admiring the variety and start questioning the purpose behind it all. Why is food being shipped thousands and thousands of miles across oceans?
And the answer isn't taste or quality.
According to this source, absolutely not. They're unambiguous. It's not because Indonesian shrimp is inherently healthier than, say, a local option. It's definitely not because it's safer. It's done solely ruthlessly because it's cheaper.
Because it exploits global differences.
Exactly. Differences in labor costs, environmental rules, how strictly regulations are enforced or not enforced.
So the pure economic logic ends up dictating the geography of where our food comes from, which leads to these incredibly long, complicated supply chains.
Precisely. And this is where the language becomes really important. What the system, and maybe its supporters, would call efficiency, this logistical miracle of moving food across the globe.
Yeah.
This specific analysis redefines it. It calls it organized negligence on a global scale.
Organized negligence. That's a strong phrase.
It is. Organized because the system itself makes it happen, facilitates it. And negligence because that very complexity, those long chains, inherently multiply the points where things can go wrong. It makes meaningful oversight almost impossible.
And that difficulty in oversight, that lack of transparency, seems crucial to how these risks stay hidden from us, the consumers.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources talk about how in this big rush to export, regulations get bent or ignored, or maybe certificates are just falsified, all to keep the product moving, keep the profits flowing. So as the person actually eating the food, you're swallowing a truly incredible amount of hidden risk because it's also opaque.
That lack of transparency is like the oxygen that negligence needs to breathe. Consumers are, perhaps intentionally, kept in the dark. You often have no real idea about the chemical inputs used or maybe hidden additives or even the true origin of what you're buying.
And that allows the system to shift the cost.
Exactly. The cost of poor safety, the potential health problems gets transferred from the producer, who benefited from cutting corners, to you, the end user.
And that transfer of risk, that leads directly to what the critique calls a really cruel irony of the whole system.
Which is
the idea that in a purely profit-driven structure, safety isn't a universal guarantee anymore. It becomes a kind of high-priced privilege.
Yeah, you definitely see that playing out. I mean, every time you go shopping, right, the source paints this really stark contrast. On one side, you have people who can afford the premium stuff, organic, verified, locally sourced, maybe.
The expensive options.
Right. And they can, to use the source's phrase, somewhat escape the roulette of contamination. They're basically buying their way into higher safety standards.
It's like purchasing insurance against the failures of the cheaper, globalized system.
Pretty much, yeah. They use their money to opt out of the main risk pool. But then you have the vast majority of people living paycheck to paycheck maybe, forced by necessity to buy the cheapest, most mass-produced options on the shelf.
Which are the ones most likely to have come through that long, complex chain of, organized negligence?
Exactly. And the source uses a very powerful, very stark term to describe what happens to that second group.
Structural violence.
Structural violence. It's defined in this context as a kind of deliberate hierarchy that's enforced by economic reality. It basically means that those without the financial means effectively become this continuous, passive testing ground for whatever poisons global trade pushes onto the shelves. They end up paying the price for the systemic failures, whether it's radioactive shrimp or heavy metals in rice or undisclosed pesticides paying with their physical health simply because of their economic position.
And it's called violence because it's inflicted by the structure itself, not necessarily by an individual with intent.
That's the argument presented, yes. The harm comes from the way the system is set up.
Okay, so moving from diagnosis to prognosis, I guess. The sources frame these repeated scandals, toxic baby formula incidents, the pesticide issues, even this absurd radioactive seafood thing. They say these aren't the core problem.
Right, they're just symptoms.
Just visible symptoms. The source uses metaphors like tumors breaking through the skin of a body that's already decaying. The actual disease, they argue, is that foundational logic of profit over life.
And if that's the diagnosis, it leads to a really difficult conclusion about what collapse actually means. We tend to think of collapse as something dramatic, right? A sudden crisis, maybe riots in the streets, some future event.
Yeah, something you'd see on the news.
But this source argues the collapse is quieter. It's more insidious.
Yeah.
And critically, it's already happening now.
Okay, how does the source define that, this insidious collapse? What does it actually feel like day to day?
It shows up as a kind of slow erosion of trust, a daily, maybe even painful realization that the system's structures, government regulators, corporations, the global supply chains, they don't actually seem to serve human life or well-being anymore. It's that moment you internalize that basic safety, like safe food, isn't actually guaranteed.
Yeah, you can almost see the decay in the signs the blogger points to. It's when ordinary people find themselves constantly asking, can I even trust the food I eat? And not just rhetorically, but as a genuine daily risk assessment.
And it's the generational thing, too. The source notes this deep irony. We have generations growing up, arguably sicker, more anxious, certainly more distrustful than their parents were, all while being told they live in the most advanced, sophisticated economic system ever created.
But the most damning sign, maybe, connects right back to that incentive structure we talked about earlier.
Corporate behavior.
Yeah. When there's a massive recall, something that's potentially harmed thousands of people, and the company involved pays a huge fine.
Okay.
But according to the critique, when the corporation just views that multi-million-dollar penalty as another cost of doing business, something that's actually cheaper than implementing really rigorous safety standards across their whole operation, that, the source says, is evidence the system has structurally imploded.
The fine just becomes a license to operate, essentially.
Yeah.
A fee for continuing the negligence.
When the cost of fixing the problem is higher than the penalty for not fixing it.
The system is basically designed to fail. From a safety perspective, it shows the economic calculation has completely detached itself from the human reality of harm, of illness. That, the source insists, is collapse already in progress.
So if the diagnosis is this bleak, where does change even begin? The source identifies what it sees as the absolute prerequisite. We have to definitively reject the illusion. The illusion that profit-driven corporations, which are fundamentally structured around maximizing shareholder value, can ever truly prioritize human well-being above that core financial mandate.
So that rejection is the philosophical starting point. Then what?
Then the proposed shift is pretty radical. It's about moving towards systems built on collective responsibility, explicitly rejecting private greed as the main engine driving necessities like food production.
Okay.
The call is for food systems that actually value things like sustainability, community health, verifiable safety over just global speed and maximizing margins.
And the ultimate goal, weaving through this analysis, seems to be redefining our basic survival needs, things like food, clean water, physical safety.
Yeah, to see them not as commodities, not as things to be bought and sold on a volatile market depending on your income.
But as fundamental human rights.
Exactly. Rights that need to be protected and shared by everyone equally.
And until that big cultural and structural shift happens.
The system that gave us the radioactive shrimp, well, it remains perfectly intact. Ready for the next scandal.
Minor regulatory tweaks, the source basically concludes. They'll always be worked around or just absorbed as the cost, as long as that foundation profit maximization remains untouched. The solution has to go deeper.
So what does this all mean? Well, the absurdity of a radioactive shrimp, it isn't just a weird headline. It's presented here as a profound, almost disturbingly clear warning sign. Evidence, according to the sources we've dug into, that the system has reached its natural conclusion decay, corruption, and slow collapse.
Yeah, and the source really leaves us, the reader, the listener, with a stark choice, doesn't it? Do we keep sort of pretending that the system can fix itself, with a few more recalls, some symbolic fines here and there? Or do we acknowledge the decay and actually start building something radically different, something that anchors its value not in capital gain, but firmly in preserving and allowing life to flourish?
So here's the thought to leave you with. If every shrimp on the plate, or maybe every cheap imported apple, serves as a reminder of these potentially rotten foundations, what specific daily decision could act as your affirmation of collective responsibility over private greed? Something to think about as you navigate those global shelves and the complex choices they represent this week.